All right, hello and welcome to WRUW-FM 91.1 Cleveland. You're currently listening to A Different Drum, where the more you love music, the more music you love. I'm your host, Matt Hook. Today I'm joined by guitarist and composer Mark Wingfield. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Wingfield is one of the most stylistically diverse guitarists I've come across. He's capable of adapting his trademark, effects-heavy guitar sound for use in many genres of music. From his more atmospheric, improvised work with guitarist Kevin Kastning, guy who we had on our show a couple weeks ago, his own classical pieces, to jazz fusion efforts with groups like Wingfield Reuter Stavis Sirkis. He really has a great, unique sound and is able to play in a lot of different contexts. Wingfield Reuter Stavis Sirkis released two great albums earlier this year, The Stonehouse and The Lighthouse. To give you an introduction to this artist, let's listen to 4 Moons off The Stonehouse. All right, that song you just heard was Four Moons off the Stonehouse by Wingfield Reuter Stavis Sirkis. So probably one of the most interesting things about those sessions was that was actually recorded in like a 6-day marathon. How did those sessions come about?
Well, it was the brainchild of Leonardo Pavkovic, the head of Moonjune Records. It's an NYC-based record label that I'm on, and Marcus and Asaf also release albums on. And Leonardo came up with the idea of flying us all out to this amazing studio in Spain, which is a 1,000-year-old stone mansion turned into a studio. It's a fantastic place, very atmospheric, and a really fantastic studio called La Casa Morada. And we were there for 6 days. The Stonehouse is actually the second album we recorded. The first album was Lighthouse, and that was the first day of recording. And it was just Asaf, Marcus, and myself. And then on day 2, Yaron Stavi arrived, because on day 3 we were meant to start recording an album of mine, which is going to be coming out in May, I believe, 2018. So Yaron turned up a day early, and we were going to do a second day with just a trio, but we thought, well, Yaron's here, why don't we do a quartet? So that's how Stonehouse happened. That was day 2, and then day 3 and 4 we recorded an album of my pieces, just another trio album, but it's very different kind of music. So Stonehouse and Lighthouse are completely improvised, and that was the plan from the outset. For those 2 sessions, was to do something completely without any rehearsal or any plan or anything written down, and there's no edits or no overdubs. I think there's a couple minimal edits, but there's no overdubs of any kind. And then on day 3, as I said, I recorded my album with a trio, which was a composed album, in a sense, a mixture of composition and improvisation, like you normally get in a jazz setting. So that's how it ended up being 6 days. Actually, that was 4 days, and the next 2 days were other recordings that I wasn't involved in. So for me, it was a 4-day session.
Now, I know you've worked with Stavi and Sirkis before, but did you do any work with Marcus Reuter before this album?
No, I'd not played with Marcus before. Of course, I was aware of his work. He's an amazing player and composer. And Marcus and I had been talking about doing something. Actually, Leonardo first suggested we do something together, and then we started talking and Skyping and discussing ideas. And actually, although those 2 albums, Lighthouse and Stonehouse, are completely improvised, we did have some ideas which I think made a big difference to how they turned out. And the ideas weren't to do with actual specific pieces of notation or anything like that, but concepts that Marcus and I came up with about how the improvisation could be structured, which took the form of sometimes a drawing or just a diagram of how the density of the music might change, or sometimes just a set of rules about who would play. Maybe we have 5 notes in the upper register and a different 5 notes in the lower register, and Marcus and I would take one or the other and then swap. So we all just discussed a lot of ideas about how music could be improvised with some structure, but without using the traditional structure, so that it would sound as if it had been written but wasn't actually written. And in the end, when we actually started playing, we started with a couple of these ideas we'd written down, and within sort of 30 seconds into the piece, usually it just took on a life of its own, and we didn't end up using the ideas specifically, but they very much informed a kind of mindset, which I think had a lot to do with why the music turned out the way it did.
So it was improvised, but you still had a couple basic concepts that you were drawing from.
Yeah, concepts not in terms of actual notes or rhythms, but concepts in terms of things like density. The music might start, very sparse, and then would become more dense for a period of time, and then more sparse again. And concepts like that, or concepts about how the energy might change in different parts of the music. But as I said, that kind of gave us an idea, a kind of I guess the other part of it was just that we were trying to. The concept was that we would try to play the music as if it to try to make it into a piece that sounded as if it had been composed or had composed elements, even though it didn't. To try to improvise as if it was a composed piece. That was, in a way, the nutshell of it. And as I said, once we started playing, the specific ideas we had, usually, we didn't follow. But it was a good starting point, and I think it really set the direction for the improvisation to take.
I mean, those sessions definitely made some very memorable music. And I'm curious, do you use that same sort of idea of creating concepts to guide improvisation if you work with someone like Kevin Kastning as well?
Yes. Kevin and I do a similar kind of thing, although with Kevin, I've done an awful lot of work with Kevin over a period of, I guess, about five years now. And we've used quite a lot of different concepts. A similar idea in that we never have any actual written music or anything specific in terms of a motif. There may have been one or two times that we had an actual, literally just before we started playing, one of us said, here's a motif, why don't we start with this off the top of our head, and then we would use that sometimes. So even that is not something that Kevin and I often do. But what we have done is use a concept like, for example, our album, let me just look at some of our albums that just jog my memory of some of the approaches we've taken.
Something like, what about like 11 Rooms, for example?
That's a good one, actually, because that one was based on Vermeer paintings. We're both a big fan of the Dutch school of painting, Vermeer, and some of his contemporaries. And I'd recently seen an amazing exhibition of Dutch masters, and Kevin had also. And so we said, oh, well, why don't we base the pieces on paintings by Vermeer and a few other painters? And so he got hold of some books, or had some books, and with paintings. And we literally sat there with the paintings in front of us as we played, and played to the painting, in a sense, describing the painting with the music. So that was one concept. And we've had other similar kinds of concepts where we take something visual or theme, something be outside of music, and use it as a way of structuring or, basing the music around.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's really like you're trying to musically describe something visual. Almost.
Yeah, in the case of that album, that's what we were doing. And it's, it's such an abstract thing, music, that it can be, in a way, based on anything from my point of view. Often when I write pieces of music, it's based on something that a story of some kind in my mind, even if the story itself is kind of abstract and just a sort of an emotional story. I sort of know what it is, and then I go about trying to describe that with music. So it's an extension of the way I generally approach music anyway, I think.
And now that we just talked a little bit about that one album, 11 Rooms, I want to play a track off it quickly. This one is called American Midwest Touch. right? That song was American Midwest Touch by Kevin Kastning and Mark Wingfield. Wingfield is currently joining me today via Skype. So, I was kind of reminded a little bit how you said you didn't play at all with Reuter before the Stonehouse sessions. How do you go approaching that, like playing completely improvised music with someone you've never played with before?
Well, I guess is a common language of sorts. I mean, Kevin and I's first album that we'd never played before, and we literally sat down and started recording, having never played a note together before. But I think for me, if I choose to do something like that, I mean, with say Kevin, I mean, he's such an amazing musician that you know that it's going to work because he can hear what you're doing and react to it and change depending from moment to moment as the music moves, and you can hear that in what he does. And I knew that before I played with him. And it's the same with Marcus. I know Marcus's music, and I know he's an amazing musician, and that he can listen and react in the moment to what's happening. So it's partly that, and it's partly having a common musical language. Again, with both Marcus and Kevin, I knew from talking to them beforehand that we had similar musical influences and a lot of similarities and connections in terms of the ideas of how we like to approach music and how we saw music, and I think a lot of it comes from that as well. So yeah.
Who are some of your musical influences?
Well, it's really, really wide, which is the same with both Kevin and Marcus. And although our influences are all very wide, there's quite a lot of in common. So for me, I love jazz. I've got a huge collection of jazz favorites that stand out from that. I mean, there's so many; it's really hard to pin it down. I really John Coltrane's a big influence. Miles Davis is a big influence, particularly his 1960s work. But I like everything Miles did, pretty much up until the 70s, late 70s. Not as keen on the stuff he did in the 80s, although it's good. What I really like is his 60s and 70s work. And I like a lot of ECM, of Keith Jarrett, Jan Garbarek. And then outside of jazz, I'm really into classical music. So everything from Bach up to, I love Ravel's piano work and Prokofiev and Stravinsky and Bartok, and more modern people like Elliot Carter, Xenakis, and Stockhausen, and the list is huge. I'm just pulling the ones that are coming into my head at the moment, but I mean, really, there's many others who I rate just as highly as the ones I mentioned. But yeah, so there's classical music that's a big influence, and then I really have a huge world influence, world music, for lack of a better word, influence, which includes a lot of Indian music, Indian classical music, which I have a big collection of. I love traditional Japanese music, shakuhachi music, and other Japanese music, African music. I've got a lot of recordings made in the 1940s and 50s of African tribal music. Oh, wow. Some of which is just amazing. And music from the Middle East as well. Big fan of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the Sufi singer. So, and lots of others too. So it's I guess those three things. Rock music as well. I mean, there's some great rock music that I love also. So it's wide, which I think Kevin and Marcus would also have a similarly wide range of influences.
Yeah, Nusrat Ali Khan, that guy's insanely good. I know Real World just did a reissue of a lot of his albums.
Oh, really? Yeah, I love his work. Absolutely amazing.
So I noticed you didn't name that many guitarists among your influences. Is there any reason for that?
Well, I think the reason is because I stopped listening to guitarists a while back. I guess, quite a few years ago, maybe even up to 10 years ago, I stopped listening to guitarists because I found that my head was full of guitar players' lines from other players, and when I was away from listening to music, away from my album collection and away from my guitar, I'd be walking around, and music ideas would come into my head, which were mine, which I could hear, and I thought, that's what I want to do. But as soon as I got home and started listening to things, suddenly my head would just be full of the usual suspects: Pat Metheny, Alan Holdsworth, Tarjei Raptal, John McLaughlin, all these great people whose stuff I love. But that's what would fill my head. And as soon as I picked up the guitar, that's what would come out. So as a way to try and get in contact with what was going on in my head when I was away from the guitar and away from my music collection, I thought there's only one solution to this, and that's just don't listen to these guys anymore. However great they are, you could just stop listening and start listening to other things instead, which I already was doing. I was listening to all kinds of other instrumentalists, but I knew that if I didn't listen to guitar players and all I could listen to was, say, singers and sax players, trumpet players, and so forth, that I wouldn't end up being able to play like they played. So on the guitar, so in a sense, they could influence me as much as I liked without me erasing my own ideas, as it were.
So it's like a way so you don't accidentally end up parroting some of your guitar heroes in a way.
Yeah, that's what I would find. I found that when I'd go to record an album and I'd go to play and I'd listen back and I think, God, this just sounds too much. I mean, having influence is fine. Everybody has influences and everybody plays things that they've heard before. But I mean, I was listening to my things and thinking, God, that sounds a lot like Pat Metheny. That sounds too much like Pat Metheny, or it sounds too much like Alan Holdsworth or whoever it was. And not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but for me, I knew that wasn't what I was after. And when I was away from everything and walking around the streets, hearing my own music in my head, I would hear other things. I would hear things which I wanted to play, which I just found very easily got lost in all the great playing of other players when I started listening to them. So yeah, that's why I don't mention it. That's why, I mean, these days I do listen to guitar players because it's been long enough that I found my own sound strongly enough that it's not going to be something I can lose now. But there was a time where I just needed to make that break as a way of getting in touch with my own inner voice, my own inner musical voice.
And how long did it take for you to kind of get in touch with that inner voice?
Well, I'd been in touch with it before then, but I couldn't control it. Like, there would be moments when it would happen, mainly in situations where it's funny. It actually would happen in two different times. Either I'd just be on my own in my own studio, at 2 a.m. or something, and I'd suddenly get in a certain state of mind, and then it would start happening. Or the other times it used to happen is I'd be in a recording studio somewhere, like in a session, and be under pressure to suddenly play now, here you go, here's your solo. And it would kind of come out then too a bit sometimes, but never consistently and never in a way that I could control and never satisfactorily. So, I knew it was there from that. And it was really, once I stopped listening to guitar players, I guess it took not all that long, maybe like 6 months or a year, until all I could do was play, in a way, try to play things I was hearing singers and sax players do. And of course, I was never going to be able to do that. So what came out was my own playing, as it were.
Going on that, when improvising, how do you prevent yourself from like repeating certain phrasing patterns or just repeating lines? Because especially for someone like yourself who improvises so often, I'd imagine it'd be almost tempting to kind of fall in those patterns again.
Yeah, well, I guess everybody has patterns. It doesn't matter who you choose. my absolute like favorite musicians in the world, if if I listen to enough of their stuff, I start to hear them play. I think, okay, they've got a set of ideas that happen here. But then if you listen to them again 5 years later, or even 2 or 3 years later, they've moved on. And so it's not that I think anybody's vocabulary is inexhaustible, but hopefully it's large enough that in a given session you don't repeat yourself too much, and as time goes on that you change and move and keep refreshing and bringing in new ideas. I don't know. I mean, I think partly for me, I don't like repeating myself. It always irks me when I do it and notice it, because I feel if I'm being true to the music, if I'm being true to the moment of improvising and really being in the music, then it's not likely to repeat itself. When I repeat myself, it's usually because I'm not in the music enough. And so I start to fall back on ideas that I've, played before and so forth. I kind of know if I'm really in the moment and really lost in the music, really one with the moment of the music, that I'm unlikely to repeat myself. And I guess that's probably why it bothered me when I do, because it's a sign to me that I'm not 100% there.
And how do you get into the music like that? I know it's kind of a abstract question, but are there certain things you try to do to kind of get you in that headspace?
No, it's just, I guess, something that you acquire over years of doing it. I don't know how to put it into words very easily. You do get into a certain state of mind. I guess maybe the easiest way of describing it maybe is that if you're listening to music and you're really, as a listener rather than a player, and it's the same with me when I'm listening as a listener, and I really get involved in the music and kind of forget where I am and who I am, and I'm just part of the music and very much emotionally wrapped up and one with the music. It's the same thing, really. It's that same thing, only you're playing an instrument while doing that. It's as best as I can describe it.
So, I know your guitar style features a heavy use of electronics. Now, you play through a Roland guitar synth, right?
No, I don't use a guitar synth very often at all. I play through a Roland VG88, but it's not a guitar synth. It's just a processor. And it has the usual things, distortion and, chorus and echo and EQ and all the rest of that. But what's different about it is that it allows you to go in deeper to the guitar sound than the usual effects, guitar effects, so that you can go in and actually change the bass format shape of the guitar sound and the basic tonal properties of the guitar sound. But it still really is just a processor. So, it picks up every little thing you do. Like even if you scrape the string with the pick, you can hear that perfectly. And, you can change the angle of the pick and you can hear that. It's every little tonal thing that you do is picked up by it. And what I like about it is it's even better at picking that stuff up than conventional guitar gear is. I always found that when I use conventional guitar boxes and amplifiers that they tended to coat the sound with a lot of stuff, and so that if I did subtle things with the tone of how I played, and the way I play, a lot of what I do is to do with the subtly altering the tone and pitch and attack and all those kinds of things. And I found that wasn't coming through very much with the usual guitar setup. It would get covered up. A couple of distortion boxes and an amplifier with a bit of distortion. Before you know it, that stuff's kind of all gotten submerged. I mean, it certainly is possible to have a conventional setup that allows that to come through, but I found it difficult to get the kind of creamy, sustainy tone I wanted and not get all that sort of thing covered up. Whereas the VG, the reason I use it is in a large part because I can get a really thick, rich, sustaining tone, but every tiny nuance of what I play is kept there intact. So, just this way I might pick the string differently, or how I might tonally affect the note, is all preserved nicely. And to me, that's essential.
Now, so with the Roland VG88, do you like plug it through into a laptop and then through plugins to create sound?
Yeah, I do. I don't very often actually play directly through the laptop. Sometimes I do, but generally the sound that you hear from my main lead sound is just the VG88. But I use the laptop to enhance that, to add into it as a sort of parallel. So I've got my main sound, and then mixed in with that are other sounds that have been processed on the laptop. And sometimes I will add synth behind as well, but the synth is only ever back behind the main guitar sound. I don't think I've actually used a pure synth sound in many, many years. I think the last album I remember doing that was Fallen Cities, which was a long time ago. So yeah, but I use the laptop to add things. Like sometimes I might add a sort of a breathy kind of a tone, or an extra kind of tonal variation that I will bring in with a pedal, and all those kinds of things are done with a laptop. And I also use it to create soundscapes behind what I play. So I often will use the laptop to create a chord behind what I play based on the single notes that I play. So I'll be playing single notes as a lead line, and then I'll feed selected notes of those into the laptop using pedals, and the laptop will sustain those notes, creating a chord behind me based on what I'm playing, and then I can change that chord at any point to a new one, again by feeding new notes into it. So yeah, I use it for all sorts of things like that.
Wow, that's fascinating. So I wanted to play a song off your 2015 album, Proof of Light. This one's called Mars Saffron. All right, that song you just heard was Mars Saffron by Mark Wingfield off his 2015 album Proof of Light. Today I'm joined by Mr. Wingfield himself. Thanks again so much for coming.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be here.
So is that track, was it improvised or was it composed?
That's composed. All the tracks on that, apart from the one I think it's called Voltaic, is improvised, or the second half of it, there's a long kind of improvised part. But no, that like most of the other tracks there's a chord progression and a melody and an arrangement. So we knew beforehand what was going to happen. We knew that we were going to start with the melody and then have solo, back to the melody, drum solo, and so forth like that. In a more usual jazz format. And the album that's coming out in May, this coming May, that was the third album recorded in the same session as Lighthouse and Stonehouse, is a similar album. It doesn't sound similar to Proof of Light. It's very different sounding, but it's similar in the sense that it's composed pieces with a lot of improvisation in a sort of normal, more standard jazz format. Not that the music's standard jazz, but it's similar in that sense that you know what the melody and the chords are, but pretty much everything else is improvised.
Yeah, it follows that standard jazz form.
Yeah.
So in the new album, do you have a title for it yet?
Don't have a title yet, no. It is mixed and it's just waiting to be mastered, and in this case, I haven't come up with the name of the album or any of the track names yet, and that's something I need to do. So we're going to be working on that next, and working with an artist for the cover design, and so that's all happening now.
So I'm curious, how do you make track names for instrumental music like this?
I find it really, really hard. I have to say, I find it really, really tough. Kevin actually comes up with the names for most of the songs that we do together. I think the track you played actually from 11 Rooms, what's it called now?
American Midwest Touch?
Midwest Touch. I kind of came up with that title, although I think Kevin made it slightly more poetic sounding than I did. But in generally, all the other tracks on that album and most of the albums we do, he comes up with, and he's really good at coming up with track names. He just has a knack for it. I find it really hard, and I usually get the help of friends and family listening to the album and brainstorming. Sometimes I know roughly what the name should be, or I know the kind of name it needs to have, but oftentimes it's hard. I find it hard because music's such an abstract thing, and even if I know exactly what it means, to me, on an emotional level or an atmospheric level or whatever, sometimes it's very hard, I find, to put a name to that. And often it's a matter of finding a name that fits with that, but doesn't pin it down too much. Because again, I know everybody who hears it's going to hear it in their own way, and that's part of what I like about music, is the fact that everybody gets something a bit different, or maybe even very different from the same piece of music. And then some people might get the same thing or similar to what I get, and some people might get something really quite different. And I like that aspect of music, so I don't want the names to kind of pin it down too much.
So I'm curious, how did you first get into this style of experimental music?
I guess I've always done it in one form or another. I mean, when I was, starting out, I played all kinds of music, rock music, and mainly rock music, and jazz. But pretty early on, in fact, even before then, when I was really just, a teenager, I was already wanting to do music that was, I guess you'd call it experimental, just simply because the music I liked, to me, sounded like that anyway. The jazz I was listening to sounded like that, and I liked so many different kinds of music that when you put all that together, it doesn't fit into any obvious genre, so it ends up being a mixture of things, and therefore ends up sounding, I guess, for lack of a better word, experimental. But for me, it's not so much experimental as just music, and it's a mixture of influences. And for me, it's all just a matter of trying to create the mood that I have when I wrote the piece. I start with an atmosphere, and an emotional story usually. And I know what that is. It's usually quite sort of a strong thing for me, and it's a matter of me trying to translate that into sound. And so I use whatever I need to stylistically to make that happen. And sometimes it's a mixture of classical influences and jazz influences and rock influences, whatever it needs to make that happen. And the other things I do, the improvised music I do, that's completely improvised, like with Kevin and those two albums with Marcus. To me, it's part of the same thing. It's just doing that in real time, as opposed to composing it first.
Gotcha. So what would you say to a young musician trying to develop their own sound?
I would say listen to a wide range of music, really wide. So I think the biggest problem that people have, I mean, I do have students and I teach people, and I often come across this very problem. It's hard to find your own sound, and part of it is being determined to do that. I know with me, it was an absolute must. Either I find my own sound or I'm not going to do it. I don't know why that is, but it was just, that's what it was like for me. So I kind of was willing to stop at nothing and find something somehow, find my own thing somehow. I think that's part of it, and I think part of it is not listening to a closed set of things. If you just have a set of your favorite players and you just listen to those, it's almost impossible to escape that and not to end up sounding like a combination of two of them at best, or more likely a lot like one of them in particular. So I'm not saying you just have to stop listening to guitar players entirely like I did, although I think that's a really good way. You should start by copying people. When you're really starting out, you have to do that. But then once you feel you're starting to get trapped, then I would say, yeah, stop listening to guitar players and start listening to all the other great instruments out there. The sax players are just off the scale amazing. For if you think about their lines in terms of guitar, it's a treasure trove of fantastic, amazing playing. And it's the same if you listen to great piano players or trumpet players and singers. If you listen to what a singer can do with their voice in terms of how they can change the tone within a single note, even from, very light, whispery to full kind of raspy sound, or a great sax player can do the same thing. Guitar players, it's really hard to do that. It's hard to get that to happen. Guitars can very easily just turn into a kind of a ping. You pick the note and you just get a ping sound, and that's the end of it. And that can end up making guitar players play too many notes sometimes, I think, the fact that they can't do enough with one. But there's an awful lot to explore there, I think, on the guitar. A lot of uncovered territory if you listen to other instrumentalists and try to figure out ways to make that happen on the instrument. So that would be my advice. Listen to a huge, wide variety of stuff. Go right out there. Listen to things from the other side of the world. Immerse yourself in contemporary classical music and medieval church music and, all styles of rock music and all styles of jazz, and don't just listen to it a bit, really, really immerse yourself in it, and that will come out through you in a unique way.
So you said you teach students. I saw on your website you do offer Skype lessons online. Are you still doing that? And is there any way our listeners who may be interested could sign up for something like that?
Absolutely. I teach lots of people via Skype. So anybody who's interested, do contact me. Just go to my website, click on teaching, and click on the contact button. And yeah, I'd be very happy to set up a lesson. I love teaching people. I love passing on information. I was lucky enough to learn from lots of great musicians I played with over the years, and so I like to pass that on. And I love seeing the light bulb light up when, sometimes you just explain something to somebody, a simple little thing can suddenly make the light go on for somebody, and I find that really something I enjoy doing. So yeah, whatever it is, I mean, you don't have to be necessarily incredibly advanced to have lessons and learn something. It's all about trying to make what you do work better, and you get more out of it. And so, yeah, get in contact anytime you feel like it. I'm here.
So again, if you're interested in signing up for lessons with Mark, you can go to www.markwinfield.com/teaching. I think there's a little contact tab under that. So also, if you're interested in hearing his music, I know your music is available on most major streaming sites, correct? But I think the Stonehouse and the Lighthouse are only on Bandcamp, right?
I think that's right. I'm not sure what my label has done in terms of the streaming services, but it's all available on Bandcamp. And Bandcamp's great because you can stream from Bandcamp once you bought the album. And of course, most people have kind of realized now with streaming is that the musicians and the record labels don't get paid anything from streaming. Or what they get paid is, so tiny that you can't possibly run a label or anything on it, even if you sell a lot. We're talking about pennies for thousands of plays kind of thing. So that's why Bandcamp's great, because they pay decently and they give the listener a streaming service. So I would recommend that. But I think some of the albums are on Spotify and those kind of services. But I think Stonehouse and Lighthouse will end up on there eventually. But it's a matter of record labels and the whole industry trying to survive really at this stage, which it's struggling to do because of no money coming in. And so I think sometimes things are delayed going on the streaming services so that they can try and recoup, at least break even on the production costs of something by selling CDs and high-res downloads. And once they feel they've recouped what they can, then it goes onto the streaming services where they know they won't get anything from it, if you see what I mean.
Oh, I got you. That makes sense, especially because, I mean, I know if streaming is just the volume, so many people get so much of their music through streaming, but it does only pay the artist and the label, like, only really cents. It's kind of pathetic how little that money they give.
I think it's 0.0001p per play, something like that. I think it's calculated that you don't get, for 1 million plays, you don't even make US minimum wage. It's really, it's not really payment. I know they're fighting it in the courts at the moment and trying to get decent pay out of these streaming services, but they've got the best lawyers in the world. So whether anything will be one of that, who knows? For the moment, nobody's making any money. And unfortunately, the gig scene is pretty much the same. It's getting really tough out there to make any money from gigging, apart from just about getting by. So yeah, I think that's why the labels are pursuing the audience of people who are willing to pay something, and they tend to be people who are wanting the high-res audio, which is great. I mean, it sounds fantastic. High-res audio sounds exactly the same as it did coming out of the studio mixing speakers. It's just a fantastic sound. And people that like to collect and have CDs or vinyl. So yeah.
All right. So any closing statements you'd like to make?
No, I mean, I don't want to say anything bad about streaming because there's nothing wrong with streaming, and people want to stream, and I think it's fine. If people want to support the music, I would say buy the album in whatever form, and then stream it to your heart's content. But support the artists if you want people to be able to continue to put music out. Apart from that, I've got a new album coming out in May, which will be available on Moon June Records and Bandcamp and so forth. Lots of interesting things coming up next year. I've got another album with Kevin that is in the works. It's been recorded. And I've got another really interesting session coming up in next May. Again, back at the La Casa Morada studio in Spain, that 1,000-year-old mansion studio. And with lots of really amazing musicians from around the world turning up, and we're going to create lots of hopefully interesting music. So that should be fun and interesting, and I'm sure it will result in quite a few new albums. So yeah, I think that's it really, unless you have any other questions.
Nope. Thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, that Casa Morada in Spain, that must be just such a magical place to record.
It's an amazing place. It really is. It's in the middle of the studio. You've got this tower that comes down through the roof and goes up out of the roof, obviously. That is stone, and you can go kind of inside. It's got open archways, and that is, I think, well over 1,000 years old. And the rest of the building is, varies in age from, several hundred up to 1,000 years old. And yeah, it's an amazing, beautiful studio, and great people there that run it. Fantastic engineer. So yeah, and you go outside it, and it's very much like being in a spaghetti western. I find it looks like, a spaghetti western.
So they
It's
have a
dusty,
Some have a Sergio Leone film.
Yeah, it really. I'm not in there, but as soon as you get outside, it really is like that. I was walking around out there, and I even found a half-smoked cigar on the dusty road, and I felt like I had just stepped into a spaghetti western. But yeah, really a great place.
Morricone
Great
starts
people.
playing in the background as soon as you walk outside.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And again, if you're
My pleasure.
again, stay
Thanks so
tuned.
much for having me.
And now stay tuned for survey class.